Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. I want to thank IRD before I make my comments for having this event. I also want to thank all of you for the work that you do. I know many of you have been involved in this for many, many years. I also want to thank the Jewish community. I learned so much in the 80s from the Jewish community. I went to that rally that President Reagan spoke to on the mall in the 80s. And lastly, when you look at that with regard to the Nubian Mountains, keep in mind that the largest, one of the most prominent law firms in this city represents Bashir, who is an indicted war criminal who's been involved in genocide there in Nuba and also in Darfur. And it continues. And a major law firm in this city represents an indicted war criminal. There are many passages in the Bible that tells us that we should care deeply about those being persecuted. Proverbs 24 says, remember those being led away unto death. 1 John, but if anyone has the world's goods and see his brothers in need and yet closes his heart against them, how does God's love abide in him? Let us not love in word or speech, but in deed and truth, and so many others. The book of Hebrews, remember those in prison as if you were their fellow prisoners, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. Many in the church do care and are speaking out, but overall, I think the church in the West has been relatively silent. Many of you know the words of the song, The Boxer, that Simon and Garfunkel sang in Central Park. It says, man hears what he wants to hear, but then disregards the rest. There are the cries of the persecuted that we in the church are refusing to hear. All over the world, people of faith are denied fundamental and an inalienable human right to confess and express their faith according to their conscience. According to the Pew survey, you know that almost 75% of the world's population live in a religiously repressive nation. The task is urgent. The stakes are high, but what remains to be seen is whether the people of God will rise to the occasion for such a time like this. All of us, most of you, have borne witness to see the tragic state of religious persecution that is a daily reality for people around the world. From China to Iran to Egypt, from Pakistan to Vietnam, the face of repression varies, but the outcome is the same: harassment, fear, imprisonment, in many cases, even death. In country after country, freedom of religion is indeed compromised, and Christians, to borrow a phrase from history, are in the eye of the gathering storm. I will just concentrate on the Middle East, but Nigeria, 21,000 Christians have been killed in Nigeria, and the church has been relatively silent. China, Catholics are being persecuted. Protestants are being persecuted. Falun Gong are being persecuted. Uyghur Muslims are being persecuted. Muslim children are being gathered up and put in detention camps, almost like a movie out of World War II. And we see what's taking place in Tibet. 140 Tibetan monks and nuns have poured kerosene on their bodies, set themselves aflame to kill themselves in protest of what the Chinese government is doing, and yet we see silence from the church in the West. In Iraq, Christians have suffered tremendously. The summer of 2014 was marked by the swift, and I say largely unanticipated, rise of ISIS. A caliphate was declared. Christians were told to leave, and if they stayed, to convert, to pay a tax, or die. I spoke to a Christian woman that said she was sold 20 times by ISIS. And keep in mind, as we speak today, there are 3,000 Yazidi women and girls who are still missing, and it's almost like the world has almost forgotten about them. It is worth noting the rich biblical history, heritage contained in these lands. More took place in Iraq than any other country of the world other than Israel. The patriarch Abraham came from Nasiriyah, modern-day Nasiriyah, Jacob spent 20 years in Iraq. A remarkable spiritual revival, as told in the book of Jonah, occurred in Nineveh, present-day Mosul. Daniel lived much of his life there. Both Daniel and Ezekiel was buried. I could go on, and we saw 3.5 years ago that ISIS blew up Jonah's tomb, and there was barely a word of comment really from the church in the West. In 2003, Iraq's Christian population was 1.5 million. Today, it's roughly 250,000 more or less. Some fled to neighboring countries, including Syria, only to be uprooted once again in the current conflict that's taking place. 2 years ago, a group in England called Aid to the Church in Need said Christianity will disappear in 5 years if major things are not done by the West. Fortunately, to the credit of the Trump-Pence administration, help is now being given to Christians and the Yazidi population in Iraq. However, with some notable exceptions, and some have spoken out. People like Cardinal Dolan have spoken out. People like Rick Warren have spoken out. People like Franklin Graham have spoken out. People like Russell Moore have spoken out. But with many, many exceptions like that, overall, the church in the West has been relatively silent. The church has not been seized with a crisis facing the church in the Middle East, in Syria, or in Egypt. To a person, when we're there, we ask, every Christian expressed a pervasive sense of abandonment. These courageous men and women of faith could not understand why the burning of churches, the forced conversions, and the emergence of a caliphate in the cradle of Christendom was not being met by urgency and by action by fellow believers in the West. These Iraqi Christians spoke with great conviction about their abiding belief in God's greatness, in goodness and faithfulness, despite their suffering. In Syria, the Christian population is dropping as the conflict continues. Today, the Apostle Paul could not safely travel the road to Damascus. In Egypt, we see continued persecution of the Coptic Christians. Today, Joseph would likely not take Mary and baby Jesus to Egypt for safety, as he did in the days of Herod. And we see growing anti-Semitism all over the world today, and almost very few in the church is speaking out against it. The persecuted church can seem a distant thing from our pews and sanctuaries in the West. But these brothers and sisters of faith yearn for our prayers and cry out for attention. And with all of the Scripture, it almost mandates that what we must do. Perhaps Americans and other Western Christians in particular are afraid of being accused of self-pleading if they demand justice on behalf of their fellow Christians. In 2013, I got back from a trip in the Middle East, and people kept saying, Mr. Wolf, can we get a special envoy or somebody that can advocate for the persecuted Christians, but Yazidis and Baha'is and the Ahmadis? And I put in a bill with Anna Eshoo. It was a bipartisan bill. We invited groups from all across the spectrum, and almost everyone came. Cardinal Worrell, God bless him, came and gave an eloquent address. The one church that didn't come was my own denomination, the Presbyterian Church of the United States, USA, did not come, and I've been a member of the Presbyterian Church since I was a little boy back in Southwest Philadelphia, and I still belong to a church out of Vienna, Presbyterian Church USA, and they would not come because they said they may offend some in the Middle East. Perhaps they are concerned with how the cultural elites, many of whom are antagonistic toward Christianity, and for that matter, most of the commonly held social teachings of the world's major religions, will perceive them. In a conversation with a college professor, he said that perhaps many have bought in to the level that the premise of liberal secularism, namely that religion in general and Christianity in particular, is inherently oppressive. He described this belief as figuring into the narrative. Christians are always the oppressors, never the oppressed. Always the persecutors, never the persecuted. Given the time limitations, I will not delve into the manifold ways in which that narrative is untrue, except to mention which any student of history knows to be true. Namely, it was Christians whose pursuit of justice animated the movement against slavery in the 18th century, led by the likes of William Wilberforce. And for civil rights in the 20th century, championed by none other than Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And it's been men and women of faith confronted with the plight of the prisoner and burdened by the struggles of the poor, who still today seek the dignity of every man and woman and child. Christians have started respected universities and hospitals around the world. Christians run major feeding programs for the poor. The Salvation Army, which responds to every major humanitarian crisis in the world, does so in the name of Jesus. Mother Teresa, who helped the poorest of the poor in India, did it because of a deep and abiding faith in Jesus. Chuck Colson, who led the way on prison reform, did it because of his faith in Jesus. And Dr. Brantley with Samaritan's Purse fought Ebola in Africa even before our own government acknowledged it as a problem. Dr. Brantley got the disease himself, almost losing his life, as all true disciples are called to do, because of his faith in Jesus. Imagine what the world would be like today without Christians acting because of their faith. If the church in the West fails to prioritize the plight of the church globally, it is naive to expect government leaders to do the so. Cardinal Dolan, who has done a great job, who in his farewell address as the head of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, urged the bishops to extend their efforts. Here's what he said: extend the efforts because on the dramatic front lines of this battle, where Christians are paying for their fidelity with their lives, end of quote. Yet, too few in the American church are burdened to the point of action for their suffering brethren. Dr. Martin Luther King's letter, and I think everyone should read it a couple of times a year, letter from a Birmingham jail was addressed to his fellow clergymen. Early in the letter, he speaks of his love for the church. But then Dr. King goes on to admonish his fellow clergymen, and he says the following. He says, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama, a few years ago, he said, I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt the white ministers and priests and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, he said, some have been outright opponents. All too many have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent. Could we not substitute the words that he said to be also with the modern critique of today? Might not the imprisoned Pakistani Christian Asia Bibi, who's been in jail for over 8 years, now say, oh, I thought I would be supported by the church in the West? Might the fearful Coptic Christian priest cry, I thought the ministers in America would be among my strongest allies? Might the Iraqi nun who I've traveled with in Iraq, Sister Diana, say, well, why isn't the church in the West helping us today? If the church slumbers, Washington will scarcely lead the way. The Old Testament book of Isaiah said, if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like a noonday. To return to Dr. King's letter, Dr. King went on to write, so often, he said, the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound, but he said the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose the authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning. When I go on college campuses, these young children are interested. These students care deeply about social justice. They want to see the church involved. And there's an opportunity with the Generation Z and with the millennials. This issue can mobilize them because every chapter you go on, every college has an IJM chapter, and they would have a chapter to do something on the issue of religious freedom. I think this is a message for the church today. The church in the West should always speak out against oppression of people of all religions, whatever is taking place and whatever the religious faith that's being persecuted. I'm convinced that as those being persecuted become more than faceless, nameless victims in distant wars and hard-to-pronounce prison cells, and as we commit ourselves to knowing their stories, weeping at their wounds, interceding on their behalf through prayer and advocacy, that we will find ourselves shaped by these men and women, these giants of the faith. And we're clear-eyed about the times in which we live. I believe these encounters will make our own faith more robust and strengthen us for the days ahead. My hope is that the suffering church would no longer suffer alone, that we would stand with them, that we would seek a day when, in the words of the beloved Christmas carol, O Holy Night, all oppression shall end. When asked why he continually spoke out against injustice, Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said, "If I remain silent," he said, "I may help my own soul, but if I do not help others, I poison my soul." Silence, he said, never helps the victims. It always helps the victimizers. What he said was powerful. It never helps the victims. It only helps the victimizers. In fact, silence actually encourages the wrongdoers to continue their act of violence. In the 18th century, British member of the Parliament, William Wilberforce, who our organization is named after, said this to his fellow countrymen about the evils of the slave trade. Wilberforce says, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you do not know." The church in the West can never say it does not know what is taking place in Iraq or the Middle East today. And Dr. Martin Luther King, to quote him again, said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." Have you ever been in a situation that your friend didn't say anything, but your enemy, you didn't really care what your enemy said, but the very fact that there was a silence of your friend was so devastating to you? So are we not the friends of the persecuted in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, in Nigeria, in the Nubian Mountains, in China? And in close, a friend of German Luther pastor and anti-Nazi dissident Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, "Silence in the face of evil is evil itself." He said, "Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." So we must pray, and we must speak, and we must act. Thank you. Thank you.